Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Stu Gothel, Chair of the FEDCO Charitable Foundation, a fund of the California Community Foundation. Do you remember FEDCO? It was the first discount membership department store in the nation. I joined the FEDCO board in 1998, 1 year before the board declared bankruptcy. For my research colleagues, there's no causal relationship there. But now for the good news. After paying off all of our bills 100 cents on the dollar, we were left with $7 million. We joined with the California Community Foundation, who have been awesome partners and stewards of our fund for over 20 years. For most of that time, we annually distributed over $300,000 a year in small grants to teachers in communities previously served by our stores. And interestingly, our corpus is still at that $7 million mark. A few years ago, one of our board members, Virgil Roberts, proposed that we add a focus on a key issue facing our schools. We selected the lack of persons of color in leadership positions and formed a partnership with Competence Schools and Cal State Northridge to build a mentoring program for African American males, which is still at work today. This symposium is another step in that direction. The critical shortage of qualified educators, and especially educators of color, prompts the assembly of highly qualified leaders who have agreed to share their thoughts with us this afternoon. Low salaries for 5 years of professional training, unparalleled attacks on both teachers, schools, and the curriculum, and lack of needed support for both students and adults in our schools require us to organize and to do something. And I would be remiss not to recognize the backdrop against which this symposium occurs, the tragedy of Uvalde. 19 precious children, nearly all of them children of color, 2 dedicated, saintly, courageous teachers, both teachers of color. The need, the challenge is even greater. This is important work that we seek to do. It is my hope that the next hour and a half will motivate us to do just that. The focus of today's symposium is increasing educator diversity in Southern California. The symposium is sponsored by the California Community Foundation, and we've had outstanding support from their staff, Vince Flores and Valerie Cuevas. We've appreciated that support, and we are also co-sponsored by the USC Rossier School of Education, the Cal State Northridge College of Education, and the Cal State San Bernardino College of Education. A diverse set of speakers will lay many issues on the table for our consideration and hopefully future action. To get us started, I'm honored to introduce an admired colleague, Dr. Pedro Noguera, Dean of the USC Rossier School of Education. He's been a resource to California schools since the 1990s when he engaged us in dialogue on issues of bilingual education. He comes to USC from our crosstown neighbor, UCLA, where he served as director for the Center for Transformation of Schools. That's truly an ecumenical leader. He has also held faculty positions at Harvard, NYU, and his alma mater, UC Berkeley. I'm pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Hello, Stu. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for having me part of this program. Stu is, one of ours from Rossier, and we're so honored to have him. Count him as, one of our distinguished faculty, colleague, friend, and I'm so happy to be part of this event. So I'm not sure if I should share my slides or if you have my slides already. Oh, you've got them right there. So I want to frame my remarks around the why it's so important that we diversify the teaching profession as a way of driving equity in outcomes for kids. As we know, at least since 2001, when we adopted No Child Behind, the nation has been trying to close the so-called achievement gap with not a lot of success. There are isolated examples of schools and districts that are making a lot of progress. But throughout the country, what we see is the status quo remains, and that in too many districts, it is the backgrounds of kids that is driving their outcomes. And what that means, that even as the nation becomes more diverse, our population lacks the skills coming from a diverse range of people, because Black, Native American, Latino students in particular often are not getting the education they need to be able to contribute to their families, their communities, and the society. Increasing the diversity of our educators is key to that, and that's why equity has got to be central. Equity is about giving kids what they need with respect to learning opportunities, support, and information so they can be successful. It's also about recognizing that the academic needs of a student are connected to their social and emotional needs. I want to acknowledge that pervasive inequity in our society makes this difficult. If it weren't for that, we would have probably made much more progress. But we know we have kids who come to school who lack basic needs in housing and health and even in nutrition. But I would say that when educators are focused on equity, they focus on the things they do control rather than rationalizing failure because of the things they don't control. I'll talk more about that. Could advance the slide. So too often our reform efforts have paid insufficient attention to what's actually happening in the classroom. And in the classroom is what we see: learning environments that bring out and nurture our kids to be engaged and to focus on learning is where the rubber meets the road. For that to happen, we need leaders who understand the difference between technical and adaptive work. The adaptive work occurs through instructional leadership. It occurs when there are principals and administrators who are able to go into classrooms, provide support to teachers, bring teachers together to collaborate lessons, and guide efforts to improve outcomes for kids. So for that to happen, I always remind principals who are listening out there, the most important work happening in any school is happening in the classrooms, not in your office. And if you're not in the classrooms, it means you're not connected to the most important work. So I want you to think about the equity challenges in your schools and what you're doing to respond to those. If you could advance, please. We have an instructional problem in this country. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, called it a banking approach, where we continue to rely heavily on direct instruction, too much on control of kids, too much focus on memorization and test preparation, and lower level thinking. More recently, what we've seen is an effort to focus on engagement, to promote deeper learning, which is about the utilization of higher order thinking skills, which only happens when we focus on the learning process and are willing to empower students as learners. Advance, please. So in the typical classroom, and this is a large one, lots of kids, one teacher, focuses on control. Advance the slide. Take a look at this classroom. This is a middle school classroom in East LA, Hollenbeck Middle School. And as you can see, the kids are out of their seats. They're not just learning math in this 90-minute class, they're also learning about how to work together, to collaborate, how to deal with conflict when it arises, how to problem solve, and the teacher can now become the facilitator of learning, right? And as you see, this is a teacher who knows her students, so therefore she knows which kids can work together, which kids need support. She teaches this way because she knows this is how they learn. So I want to ask you, those who are watching, how often do my students get to learn in this way? How often do my students get to learn in a manner that's student-centered, focused on empowerment rather than teacher-centered? When we focus on empowering kids, we're focusing on engagement. And that's behavioral. That means, are they prepared? Are they on task? It's cognitive. Do they understand what they're doing? And it is emotional. Do they care? Are they putting forth their best effort? When you bring all three together, I guarantee we will see higher rates of achievement. Engagement is the pathway to achievement. Advance, please. So diversity is essential because what the research shows is that when you have educators from diverse backgrounds in the school, they're better able to make expectations clear and explicit to kids. They are the warm demanders that Gloria Ladson-Billings writes about, who are able to model and expose kids to what good work looks like, which is so essential because many children learn through modeling, which is why many of us even use YouTube as a way to learn something when we don't understand it. They're constantly checking for understanding. They create an environment where it's safe to make mistakes because kids learn through their mistakes, and safety, not just physical safety, but social, psychological, and emotional safety is essential for learning. They provide numerous opportunities for kids to revise work, because the real learning doesn't happen on the first draft, it is in the revision. The real teaching is not in the grading, but in the feedback we provide. And then they motivate kids by connecting the material to their lives, which means you've got to know your students. So I want you to think about, what are we doing to cultivate these kinds of skills? The good news, kids can learn from any teacher if they know they care, if they're doing these things. That's not to say that we don't need teachers from diverse backgrounds, because diversity adds something else to a school. It means there are a group of people collectively who are better able to engage with students, parents, and community. Advance this slide. What we're trying to avoid is what we could call the trajectory of marginalization, where a student becomes disengaged in a task, they don't like reading, therefore they don't like social studies, science, or math, because they're all literacy-based. Next thing you know, they don't like school, they don't want to be there, and they are on a path towards structural disenfranchisement. In this country, we have millions of Americans who are structurally disenfranchised because they don't have the education. We could have addressed that early. Early intervention works so much better, so much more effective than late intervention. Advance, please. So cross-cultural teaching is often a problem in many schools because many teachers claim they're colorblind. They claim they don't see racial differences. That's hard to imagine because we live in a society where race figures so prominently, where stereotypes figure so prominently. And it doesn't mean we want teachers to look at everything through race. It does mean we want them to understand who their kids are. We want them to understand what their needs are, how they learn, so they can build strong relationships. We also want them to focus on the strengths of their students rather than the deficits. Because the research shows when we can help kids to become more confident, more competent, they will become more resilient. And then finally, we need teachers of all kinds with moral authority. You know, that's what's called for in this moment. Moral authority is not rooted in your title, it's rooted in your relationships with your students. And locus parentis, right, that's the term we use for the legal responsibility of teachers, literally means you are there in place of the parent. Think about how heavy that responsibility is right now. Advance the slide, please. We want teachers who are culturally competent, who are able to work with a wide variety of learners, which really means the ability to understand their own stereotypes, to check them, to approach teaching without bias, to have an openness to cultural differences so that they can work with kids of all backgrounds. So part of what we want is culturally responsive teaching in our schools, which means teachers who see the culture of their students as a resource, as an asset that they're going to build on. When our kids are multilingual, when they're able to navigate multiple worlds because they can speak more than one language, they're adept in more than one culture, they are actually better off and better able to navigate the world. And for that to happen, we have to have teachers who know how to draw on the strengths of their students so that the kids don't feel like they have to give up their culture in order to get an education. Advance, and I'll try to wrap up. Part of this means treating culture as a resource, drawing on those cultural resources of the family, what we call the funds of knowledge that families bring, which means you have to know the community you serve. And so I'll close with this. Good teaching is like good cooking. How do you know someone's a good cook? Well, the people who eat it tell you that was good. They tell you they want more. When kids are getting good education, they will let us know. It'll show up in the learning. And that's what we want from all teachers. And that's, again, why we need teachers from diverse backgrounds in our classroom, so that the responsibility is shared across our community, across our population, in doing this very important work. So Stu, thank you. And I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noguera. Food for thought. And besides, your focus on learning really rings a bell with me because it's fun to teach that way. I'm now pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Chinaka DomNwachukwu, Dean of the College of Education at Cal State San Bernardino. He came to San Bernardino from the Azusa Pacific University, and he knows the region well. During his tenure, he's increased the number of credentialed students, especially African-American males, and is part of a regional collaborative strengthening the pipeline for minority teachers. His current priorities include an EDD program and emphasis on STEM education. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. DomNwachukwu.
Thank you, Stu, and thanks all of you for being part of this conversation, and thanks to you, Dr. Noguera, for setting the stage for this. It's indeed my honor to add my voice to this conversation on diversifying the education workforce. Let me start by saying my emphasis will be in two areas. I would like to address the scope of the problem of underrepresentation of minority teachers in the teaching force, as well as some of the actions that are already in place trying to address the problem. So first of all, the problem. According to a recent study actually from the Learning Policy Institute, the education field has continued to see a gross underrepresentation of ethnic minority teachers across the nation. In 30 years, the proportion of ethnic minority people who enter the teaching force rose only by 12%, even though the overall population has been growing significantly with minority people. Teachers of color across the nation makes only 20% of the workforce. And when we go down to specific ethnic representation, if you can go to the next slide, please. While we have about 25% of US students as Latinx by a 2014 study, only 9% of the teacher pool was Latinx. It's even worse with Black and Native American teachers, while there is some measurable growth happening in the area of the increase of minority teachers in the field. The number of African American and Native American teachers and other categories of educators are actually declining. Now, if we would also focus on specifically minority male representation, next slide. You see that another study points out that the minority male teachers make only 5% of all public education teachers across the nation, 5%. No wonder why minority males struggle. The next slide addresses some of the prevailing problems that our Black and Hispanic kids often face in the K-12 systems. Lack of a sense of belonging, because quite often, in fact, just recently I had a group of Black men that I was meeting with on a Project Impact program. And I asked them, how many of you had a male teacher in your K-12 experience? A number of them raised their hands. But when we went down to, did you have a male teacher in elementary school, in junior high or high school, the number significantly declined. The reality is that many of the kids go through elementary and junior high and not really have meaningful male exposure, male presence in their school settings. So they deal with a sense of lack of belonging, a sense of isolation on the school sites, hopelessness, cultural frustration and disengagement, especially when you talk about a Black young man in a 7th grade classroom or a Hispanic young man in a 5th grade classroom. So these are issues that our students are facing, not necessarily because they don't like school, which is part of the perception, but because the school has not really created a culture for them to feel like it's a place for them to belong. So these issues are issues that studies have shown when you have the presence of minority teachers in the school site, and especially in the classrooms, the impacts can actually be life-changing. The next slide points out some of the benefits of having a diversified workforce in the educational setting. For example, when you have Black or Hispanic teachers in the school setting, many of them, 3 out of 4 actually, tend to work in schools that serve minority kids. Elementary Black students with Black teachers study have shown, this is a study from Tennessee, it shows that they actually saw increase in their STAR test percentile by 3 to 6 points. K-3 students who are Blacks with Black teachers were 15% less likely to drop out in high school and were 10% more likely to apply to a college program. Another study from North Carolina showed that Black students who were assigned to Black teachers in grades 3, 4, and 5 were less likely to drop out of school and more likely to go to college. The last figure I want to share here is the one that I've mentioned briefly. Black boys actually from a low socioeconomic background who are receiving free or reduced lunch in grades 3 to 8, but had Black teachers, saw increase in college aspirations up to 29%. So the presence of ethnic minority teachers in the classrooms makes significant impact on both students' morale and their aspirations and ability to work hard and succeed and go to college. So let me move from the scope of the problem to some of the issues and actions that have been going on in addressing this whole issue of teacher underrepresentation of minority teachers in the school settings. The Cal State University system has invested lots of resources and efforts in addressing this problem. And CSUN is a perfect example of some of the things that have been done through the CSU system. But I just want to point out that if you go to almost every Cal State campus, there is an initiative targeting recruiting, training, and retaining minority teachers for the K-12 classrooms. Next slide, please. I point that out because more than 50% of the teachers that CSU prepares actually come from ethnic minority backgrounds. The CSU graduates approximately 6,000 teaching credential holders every year. And 1/3 of the CSU credential teachers are Hispanic or Latino. So if you look at all that number, and you also consider the fact that the CSU prepares approximately 50% of all California public school teachers that are put out there every year. So it becomes important to see the scope of the problem and also see that things are being done at our own level in the state of California through the CSU system to address this problem. On our campus at CSUSB, I want to point out, if you go to the next slide, that CSUSB is the largest supplier of teachers in the Inland Empire. And when I say Inland Empire, if you don't know, some of you, I mean, most of you know that it's made up of 2 counties, the counties of Riverside and San Bernardino. And we are the only CSU serving these 2 campuses, counties. And we provide more teachers to this Inland Empire region than any other institution. We have many sister institutions in this area, both private and public, but we serve this region. And why I point this out is because we are also in a population that is highly diverse, where the need for a diversified workforce is highly needed, is highly important. If you go to the next slide, you see the multiple programs that we offer. We offer all kinds of teaching credential programs, starting with multiple single special education. I believe we are about one of the two, or if not the only campus that offers career and technical education credentials across the state. And these credentials target meeting the scope of need that exists. And just this year, as we are concluding, we are credentialing more than 540 teachers who are going into the workforce. And in the light of what I've just talked about, we launched an initiative about 3 years ago at Cal State San Bernardino addressing this whole issue of underrepresentation of minority people in the teaching field. We called it Project Impact. Next slide, please. Thank you. Project Impact is an initiative to increase the diversity of teachers in the region by intentionally recruiting men of color with a specific focus on African American and Latino males. Next slide. While there are a lot of efforts across many parts of CSUs, one of the ways we have distinguished what we are doing at CSUSB is our engagement is targeted to focus on 4 major areas of focus: recruitment, training, deployment, and mentorship. In recruitment, we're working with school districts and county offices of education to create pipelines. We have all kinds of outreach engagements that are happening in the region, media campaign, and marketing programs using all kinds of technology. We bring these candidates that we're recruiting. So let me clarify. Our recruitment is a collaborative engagement that involves the school districts and the county offices of education who are working with us to identify men, Hispanic and African American men, who may be on the substitute teaching list, maybe custodians, maybe working already in the school system in different categories, but did not ever think they could get a credential to become teachers. They would like to. And we're identifying these men, bringing them into the program, providing them a multi-tier teacher preparation program that gives them access to resources that go beyond the traditional teacher preparation program. A lot of them we are starting them with pre-intern experiences because some of these men have jobs, have family, and they need support to be able to finish their program and move on. So we get them internship opportunities, and we work with the school districts in the area of deployment to make sure that they are placed in high need areas where they will be able to serve this population that we are talking about. And one new thing we introduced is a mentorship program for these men, which goes beyond the credential preparation, in which we are working with them to assign them other professionals who are men of color, who are in the field, who will mentor them over an extended period of time until they gain their tenure in the school system. That is so we can address the teacher attrition rate that often happens. So this is a current a timeline of how we have launched this program. It started in 2019. We recruited the first cohort in spring of 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. A second cohort came in 2021. A third cohort started this spring, and we are recruiting a 4th cohort, which is made up of about 30 men or more that will be starting in the fall. If you look at the pictures on the right-hand side, the top picture was taken on the 23rd. These are men who came for orientation for fall, the new group that is coming in. And at the bottom is one of our graduates who's already teaching in Palm Desert and making a huge difference. In my last slide, I will go through to say we use a cohort model. We do a lot of networking with the administrators in the field. In the middle there is Judy White, who was the superintendent for Riverside County Office of Education, who worked with us in 2019 to get this started. And if you go to the last slide, that last slide shows some of our current partners, the 2 county offices of education, Riverside and San Bernardino. The Blue Educational Foundation is an African-American nonprofit that works with high schools and community colleges to increase school going. And the Growing in Learning Achievement is another nonprofit launched through a collaboration with all the universities in this area and the K-12 educational systems that is also focused on studies and activities to increase school going. So Schools First is one of our sponsors. So I share this with you to say there is a problem. The CSU is one of the entities that have chosen to tackle this problem. And we are here at CSUSB contributing our little portion to make a difference. It's not a problem that cannot be solved. And I believe that this opportunity to share about what is going on is really appreciated. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
And thank you, Dr. DomNwachukwu. Very interesting and insightful presentation you provided. Your work is stellar at the CSUSB, and as well as the work that's being done across the CSU system through the Educator Diversification Initiative. Thank you. My name is Dr. John Reveles, and I'm a California State University faculty member. And we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to continue learning more about systems, but we're going to engage in a panel discussion. And today, we'll be continuing to learn more about systems and policies that are supporting educator diversity across LA County. There has been much relevant information presented thus far, and there's going to be more to be shared. So we'd like to encourage you to engage with our panelists during our Q&A session after each panelist presents. Before we get to that presentation, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the work that I've been doing across the last 3 or 4 years. And Dr. Stuart Gothold alluded to this work. This is the Compton Male Teacher of Color Network story. And so this work started with my collaboration with Dr. Travis Bristol, who is a distinguished professor at UC Berkeley. And he came here from the East Coast, where he had started the NYC Men Teach project initiative and the Boston Teacher Residency Program. At that time, he identified this strong need to recruit, retain, and support male teachers of color. And in this picture, you can see Dr. Travis Bristol there, along with some of the teachers of color, Dr. Ristori, and Blaine Watson, who was the principal of the school site where we started this program. In that time frame, across our work, we supported each other and we created affinity spaces. And these affinity spaces were a place where we were all drawn together because we had a shared strong interest in improving our practice as administrators and teachers. Next slide, please. And so the timeline, so the 3-year project, it's interesting that Dr. Dean DomNwachukwu presented his work on recruitment. We were focused more on retention at a similar time. So this work is being done by many systems from many different approaches, and this is great news to me. We founded our network with 8 male teachers of color and 2 administrators, one of which was Principal Blaine Watson. And at that time, we focused on male teacher of color retention. So we really specifically focused on that because that's what Compton asked us to do. And that's where we saw the need to really place an emphasis. And we started using this protocol called the Issaquah protocol, and we defined mentorship and coaching. And then we ended that first year in person at the school district office through a May showcase, where we brought the participants, the male teachers of color, and their students to talk about the impact that it had on their lives. In the second year, we extended the program, the CMTCN, if you will, by 75%. And then we added elementary and middle schools, and we intended to continue rolling this out. However, in March 19th of 2020, California was the first state to issue its stay-at-home order, and everything changed across the world. And so what we had to decide was how we're going to navigate this. However, because we had established strong networks with these men, we were able to seamlessly move from a face-to-face PD and support network or affinity space to a virtual one. And that was attended at the end of 2020 by a May virtual summit, in which case we had local and national leaders. In the third year, we continued developing our program. We wanted to scale, but because of the challenges of COVID-19, we actually had a lot of difficulty. However, we did have strong relationships with the guys that were working with us and continue to implement all PDs across the year. And we ended in 2021 with our second annual Compton Male Teacher of Color May Virtual Summit, which was, again, attended by local and national leaders. And it's important to know that the two keynote speakers that we had at both our virtual summits were Superintendent Tony Thurmond and Assembly Member Mike Gibson, who co-authored AB 520 legislation, which is now a block grant to help diversify the teacher workforce. So now I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Blaine Watson. He was as I said, he was the principal and has been on the front of this work from the onset. And he is the Senior Director of Secondary Schools in the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. The question I have for you, Blaine, is please tell us your perspective on best practices for sustaining male teachers of color and their administrators, and how that work is being fostered in the Los Angeles Male Teacher of Color Network, or LAMTCN.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And I want to thank all the colleagues and friends on the call today. This is an amazing opportunity to share best practices and what's happening across the county and our neighboring counties as well. So it's a blessing to be here. Just want to make sure everybody knows that, we're all in this work together. So thank you again. So John, to answer your question, I'd like to respond to your question. You can populate all the language in the slides, please. We're going to go ahead and talk about your question in three buckets, I want to say, or three areas, three ways. First, I'd like to outline the intended outcomes of the Los Angeles LA Unified Male Teacher of Color Network, a new initiative we launched in February of 2022. I'd also like to discuss the project conceptual framework or emerging framework. And then three, present organization conditions needed for male educators of color to thrive as teachers and as leaders in LA schools. Next slide, please. I also want to acknowledge the fact that we're talking about race today. And Dr. Noguera said it very well. Race is an important thing for us to engage. And we are going to, and we're doing that work. So I just want to thank everybody who's on this call, who's in the trenches doing this work and engaging this work of racial diversity for educators across the state in an unapologetic way. So I really do appreciate your focus in this work. Next slide, please. So getting into it, we're going to talk about three areas of capacity building that the LA Male Teacher of Color Network team is doing. The first area, we're really talking about our objectives here are about professional development to support the retention of male teachers of color in LAUSD within their first 3 years on the job. We're doing that by educating, or not even educating, I'll just say collaborating with and building capacity in LAUSD induction mentors, the individuals who are going to be interfacing and supporting new teachers. Secondly, with principals who have the power and the control to create the culture and the organizational structure at the school site to support their new teachers. And lastly, principal coaches, the folks who have the influence and the support, providing support to principals to continue this work in their school sites. Also, it's important to recognize that the curriculum that we're delivering in professional development is adapted from the best practices that emerged from the Compton Male Teacher of Color Network, and also the new handbook on research of teachers of color, which is coming out. It's published this July, I believe, of 2022, authored by Dr. Gist and also Dr. Bristol out of UC Berkeley. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so this is a very interesting slide, and I just wanted to present this. MLK said this right sometime before his death. If I fear I have integrated my people into a burning house, I guess we're just going to have to be firemen. And to me, this speaks to me because it really resonates, this idea of the conditions that our male teachers of color in this context are entering our schools through. And so we have to be the firemen and women right, that are addressing the needs of male teachers of color and changing conditions so they're not caught on fire. We have to make sure that we're supporting the best way possible. Next. So first of all, Dr. Noguera was talking about the importance of focus on equity. And something that I failed to put in this presentation today is really our conversations in our LA Male Teacher of Color Network around equity-focused change in schools and school organization is really about our pedagogy, how we're teaching adults and children, also our curriculum, what we're teaching adults and children, also our structures and our procedures. And it's important for us to interrogate all of our systems through those 4 areas. So talking about our conceptual framework, there are 2 frameworks that we've adopted to do this, to really to focus and drive this work. The human resource frame, which is about the organization should exist to serve human needs. And secondly, the symbolic frame. And the symbolic frame is really about the organizational symbols and the overall culture of the organization. Again, when I mention organization, I'm talking not just about the overall school district, but I'm talking about also the school site as an organization. And again, it's important for us to interrogate the approaches through these 2 frames through equity, an equity lens. So as we're discussing the human resource frame, and again, these frames are adopted from the work of Lee Bowman and Terrence Deal, Reframing Organizations, really important frameworks for us to consider as educational leaders. As we're talking about the people in the organization or the human resource frame, it's important for us to always recognize that people are our most important asset. We're always focusing on how we're supporting their energy, their attitude, and developing their skills. 2, it's also about the relationship between organizations and human nature, thinking about a focus on their social needs, sense of belongingness, right? That was mentioned earlier. How we love and how love shows up in our work. What does inclusion look like for male teachers of color in this context? What about, we need to question our practices that build and retain people. Are we an organization focused on high involvement, high commitment, focused on job enrichment, self-managing work groups, affinity groups, and also organizational development, and also most importantly, participative management. How are managers, principals, and other leaders working with male teachers of color? Also, it's just important for us to think about the assumptions that leaders are thinking and looking at our male teachers of colors through. What are the bias that they're approaching the work with male teachers of colors through, and then how are they moving past that bias to better support male teachers of color? As we talk about the other frame, the symbolic frame, it's really about defining our organizational culture. What are the traditions, the rituals, the norms, the language, core values? How does that play out in the work we do every day? And how are male teachers of color dialed in and connected to the sense of culture in the campus or in the organization? Are we helping people identify their sense of purpose and passion? What type of connections are we making to them personally and to the work of our mission of the organization? And I said it before, our structure and our processes define our culture. So it's easy for us to have structures and processes in place that push people out or bring people in. So we have to think about what that looks like. And lastly, I would say that meaning is always created. It's not given. So us as leaders, we create the meaning, we create the feeling, we create the norms that our organization will experience, the people in our organization will experience. Next slide. And one thing I didn't mention, go back one slide, I'm sorry. It's also about we want to validate, affirm, build, and bridge. This is from the work of Shiraki Holly and also Yasso out of UCLA. How are we looking at cultural capital? How are we affirming and validating that cultural capital? How are we looking for ways to build and bridge for our folks? So we have to be very intentional in that work. Next slide. So now we're talking about creating the right organizational conditions. Again, we're talking about systems work in the organization. If we're talking about organizational alignment and policy, several districts, every district has several departments. It's important for those departments to be married in this approach. How are our strategies? How is our focus aligned across the divisions in the organization? Are we all focused, and is our policy driving a focus on supporting educators of color? And what does that look like? And how does that show up every day in our work? 2, strategy. We have to have a strategy to lead and manage change. What type of framework are we using? Because this is a change. We're changing paradigms and changing beliefs, practices, and people. And we have to think about how we safely manage a change that we need to push. Third, equity-focused leader capacity building. How are we helping leaders, again, interrogate systems through an equity lens? And then how are we helping them think about their own bias and how that shows up in their work? We want to invite and cultivate affinity spaces for male teachers of color. And that takes intentional and deliberate work. And, you know, we've encountered conversations around, well, people feel somewhat inadequate. If I'm not a male teacher of color, if I'm a white woman or an Asian woman as a leader, how do I invite and cultivate affinity spaces? So those are things we're talking about in terms of relationship building and creating trust that would then cultivate a space, an opportunity to create space for male teachers of color to feel like they belong. Also, we need to value and elevate the contributions of male teachers of color in our organization and also the school. What does that look like? How are we publicly showing our appreciation and the contribution of male teachers of color in the school space and across the organization? And I also want to say it's important for leaders to intentionally look for ways to mentor and find mentors for male teachers of color, have them mentor each other, and also look for leadership opportunities to build and increase your critical mass. And I'm talking as a principal, right? How do I intentionally cultivate a space where my male teachers of color can be another advisory group for me and help me see things that I don't see? They're attacking my blind spots for me. That's important. So my last slide in closing here, I want to talk about something we've been discussing in terms of how do we build trust with male teachers of color. And this is adopted from the work we're doing in this space with leaders in LAUSD, but also from other research. So number one, school and systems leaders address their own bias. I mentioned that several times before. Also, leaders lead through vulnerabilities and are honest about what they do not understand. They're asking for feedback very vulnerably, very authentically. Leaders should build trust by showing up and interacting authentically, being very clear about what they don't understand, and being clear about what they want to understand and how that knowledge can be improved through a male teacher of color's perspective. 4, leaders intentionally identify leadership and growth opportunities. I mentioned that as well, but to be very clear, and when we were in Competence specifically, we had male teachers of color in the space, and it was our job as administrators to say, you know what, I see you on the school site council, or I see you leading professional development, or what else would you like to do in your role in our school site, and how do I help you get there? What do you see yourself doing beyond your teaching in the classroom, and how do I help you get there? Leaders develop and evaluate inclusion and diversity strategies with male teachers of color. So that means really elevating for male teachers of color. Okay, this is what I'm doing. This is what I'm thinking about doing. This is embedded in our strategic plan, in our SPSA or single plan for student achievement, or in the actual strategy, however it's written, and then interrogating the systems that are building that approach. And then leaders would curate these affinity spaces and invite topics that matter to male teachers of color. You're not coming in that PD space saying, I have an agenda. You're working with them to develop what they want to talk about. And I will say that male teachers of color, what we learned in Compton was that they weren't just interested in talking about, their instructional dilemmas of practice. That was a very important conversation ongoingly. But also, let's talk about things that matter to us as men. Let's talk about health. Let's talk about the responsibilities of being married and being the providers for your family in some cases, or the pressures of feeling inadequate sometimes as a father and as a male father specifically. So a male of color as a father. And then I mentioned before this idea of validating, affirming, building, and bridging, knowing and recognizing cultural capital and the assets and the virtues of the people who are in your staff, and working with them. That will help people build the trust. And thank you, John, for the opportunity. And it's an honor to be here with everyone.
Indeed. Thank you, Blaine. And it's a privilege to work with you and the work that you've spearheaded and continue to work. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Marco A. Nava, the Los Angeles Unified School District Induction and Credentialing Administrator. Dr. Nava, the question I have for you is, please describe your role in overseeing administrator diversity training throughout the LAUSD.
Great, thank you, John. Yes, great question. Los Angeles Unified has a long history of attempting to address this diversity training, diversity efforts throughout our district. People who are familiar with Los Angeles know that this is a very diverse metro area. However, even within all of that diversity, we have racially isolated pockets throughout our city. For example, I attended Bell High School. a population of 95% Latinx students and community members when I was growing up there. So obviously, like Dr. Noguera spoke earlier, the resources to help every student be successful and every teacher be effective in the classroom, and then school leaders be effective on campus, the resources were not there for the needs. And even though there were efforts to tap into the strengths of the community, those assets that Dr. Noguera talked about, that was not something that was really super prevalent. So we had a very high dropout rate at our school. So now LA Unified has really started to try to make positive changes going forward. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the efforts that are going on. We are seeing some improvements. We still have a long way to go, but I'm proud to say that at least some things are changing for the better. So if we go to our next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening with our leadership development. Blaine talked a little bit about what we're doing with male teachers of color in our partnership with CSUN. But I'll talk a little bit about the leadership because my colleague, Dr. Pat Pernin, will speak to what we're doing with our teacher workforce. So for all of our school leaders, these are administrators, school site administrators, principals, and assistant principals, we have our school leadership framework. This is a set of 6 professional learning standards for school leaders. And this outlines the skills, knowledge-based dispositions that we expect all of our administrators to possess. And if they can master these, if they can gain high levels of competence in these 6 pillars, then we believe that they'll have the foundation for effective leadership at the school sites. And I called out 2 specific quotes from our learning standards. The first says that our school leaders must demonstrate cultural proficiency and knowledge of the LAUSD competencies of social emotional learning. So we've heard, how important it is to tend to academic achievement, but we know that if we ignore the social emotional, that academic achievement will be stunted. So by tending to those SEL needs of our students and adults at the school sites, we are seeing higher levels of achievement on a variety of metrics by our students. Also, we expect our school leaders to create and maintain an environment that fosters equity and culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. So again, our school administrators are receiving a great deal of professional development in the area of equity, social justice, and culturally responsive pedagogy or cultural proficiency. And one of the unique features of the school leadership framework is that all of our standards have a rubric of implementation that our school leaders can self-assess with. So they can make their own assessment of whether they're developing in practice or advancing into effective practice. And they have conversations with their supervisors to help them move along in that continuum. And as we go to our next slide, we'll see how there are some of those professional learning opportunities we're offering. And the work of equity and diversity work is not a lone endeavor. So we rely on our institution of higher ed partners like Cal State Northridge, like USC, UCLA, and the other campuses that are here in the Southern California. So we've established our Access, Equity, and Acceleration Office here in Los Angeles Unified, and they are focusing on promoting and retaining not just teachers of color, but leaders of color. So we work closely with them to promote leaders of color through our ranks. Also, IHE partnerships that we have, for example, we've worked with Dr. Tyrone Howard at UCLA. He created some professional development for our districts that all of our teachers and administrators participated in. We also worked closely with Dr. Sean Harper at USC, where he was working with a network of dozens of school principals on leading this work of diversity. And now we are looking at pathways with Dr. Noguera to continue that work. We've also done cultural proficiency, professional development. We've had a variety of speakers and topics that are covered. And through that training, we've already had over 800 administrators complete that training, and it's a multi-day training. We also partner with the Museum of Tolerance, specifically the Tools for Tolerance professional development. We have our teachers go through that session. We have our administrators go through that session. And here we've also have had thousands of our teachers go through the training and hundreds of our administrators participate in that because we want to promote not just tolerance, but equity. And if we look at the next slide, this is where we are today. Our school board has just passed a resolution calling for our district to diversify, prepare, and retain its educator workforce. And we are specifically emphasizing Black leaders, administrators, and teachers. So I think we are on the right track in Los Angeles Unified. I think there are many things that we're doing really well. We still have a long way to go. We continue to rely on our IHE partners, community-based organizations like FEDCO and California Community Foundation to help us with this work because we have limited resources. And if we're all working toward that same goal, we will move there, in much greater strides and make many more lasting gains that way.
Thank you for that very insightful information regarding the excellent work that you're doing across the LAUSD, Dr. Nava. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Patricia Pernin. Dr. Pernin is the Los Angeles Unified School District Director of the Intern Credentialing and Added Authorization Program, or ICAP. My question for you, Dr. Pernin, is in what ways has LAUSD worked to diversify their teacher workforce across the school district and various credentialing programs?
Thank you, John. It's wonderful to be here and to show and to explain what we've been doing in the Los Angeles Unified School District. The work that we have been doing to diversify the educator task force, that also includes men of color, continues on today. As we put all these pieces together, that's why I like to have this, we are putting many pieces together, as Dr. Nava has said as well. Let's quickly look back to what started in LAUSD's intentional move towards ensuring that diverse educator workforce was in place in LA. It mirrors, we want to mirror our student population as the second largest district in the country. So let's take a look at our timeline on the next slide. What's interesting to note, in the 80s, there was Senate Bill 813. Sometimes we have to go back to history and say, how did this happen? How were we able to provide a preliminary program through a local educational agency? Well, when Senate Bill 813 was passed, it was specifically targeting the needs of Los Angeles to provide an opportunity to bring into our workforce potential teachers for our schools from our community. This all began in 1983, 39 years ago, and look how it has continued today. As you can see, we began with our first need, which was prompted by our teacher shortage in the area of general education, believe it or not, single subject. As we knew that this was and continues to be an important initiative in LAUSD, we did not stop. We continued from 1983 and we said we must diversify our teaching population. We continued to expand and build our programs with the intent of ensuring equity and access to all of our programs, not only in our curriculum, but also in the work that we do for recruitment as well. And again, we started with the general education. We went to multiple subjects. We went to the education specialist teachers. We had the induction program and much more. Did not stop there because again, we were starting to build this pathway. We went a little bit farther and we said, okay, we have teacher induction. Shouldn't we be doing something with administrators? And we started our CLEAR administrative program. And again, we said, well, that's a CLEAR, but what about a preliminary administrative program? What about our CLEAR nurses services program? Again, this is where we started. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that we have a credentialing path, and I'm really proud of the fact that we did this. It's really interesting to know, because we just went through accreditation with the CTC, that one of our common standards talks about that we have to initiate, how do we provide diversity within our teaching force? And it was wonderful to see how we have done that through all the programs that we have. We start at the very, very beginning, Educators of Tomorrow, and that's actually at our school site at, for example, Bell, Canoga Park, and looking at our students and saying, are you interested in teaching? Can we help you to move forward into a college or a university and help you along that pathway to become the teacher of the future within Los Angeles Unified School District? Then we go on to our career ladder, and we have our Step Up program where we're supporting teachers' education preparation and undergraduate program. We just had some information today that was in one of our people that went through our CLEAR program was talking about how they have supported people in our career ladder to actually go into teaching, to stay within LA Unified and actually join our program, which is the ICAP program. Then we have all of our ICAP preliminary teacher credentials that we have. We have MMSN, which is the mild moderate support needs, the ESN, which is extensive support needs, the early childhood, the general education, multiple subject and single subject, and even some added authorization. So again, diversify our community, our workforce. We have the ICAP added authorizations. We have Korean, Mandarin, Spanish, French for all of our dual language schools. We have reading and literacy, again, to close achievement gaps on autism. But that wasn't enough because, as you see, we have to have teacher induction. Again, bringing teachers in from other universities as well to diversify our teaching workforce. Again, not enough, and I'm so happy to say we had the CLEAR administrative program, which Marco had to also talk about, Dr. Nava had talked about, and also the preliminary administrative services. CLEAR came first, and we said, well, we need some place to feed into our preliminary, into our CLEAR, and then our CLEAR nursing services credential. The reason why we decided to go in the CLEAR nursing is because we wanted to diversify as well our population for the nurses in the schools. So again, this is all very important information that we have. As we continue to look at our support, in particular, as noted by the speakers previous to me, we have support for our male teachers of color through the collaboration with CSUN, through the Los Angeles Male Teachers Color Network. It was so wonderful this past spring when we went through all the professional development, and we provided this professional development for all of our lead mentors in both the induction as well as in our preliminary program. How phenomenal was that? And we took a survey, and I do have to tell you this, we only took the survey 2 weeks ago because we wanted to find out what our teachers thought about this, our actual lead mentors who are mentoring all of our teachers. And 2 weeks ago, we surveyed them, and our mentors in our induction program said that they were happy to report that now 11 of our induction mentors indicated they would love to start an affinity group next year for male teachers of color. So we're actually figuring out how are we going to do that this summer and use the ISSAQA protocol to provide support to retain our male teachers of color. This is so important for all of us that we retain our teachers, our male teachers of color, so they do not leave us, that they stay with us, that we build them and their capacity to work with all of our students. So as you can see, we did not stop with the initial preliminary program, but we continued and will continue to provide a pathway and support necessary to provide a diverse educator work task force, ready to meet the needs of our students and our families in LAUSD. John?
Thank you so much for that information, Dr. Kernan. It's really insightful, and it is a pleasure and an honor to continue to work with you. I'm looking forward to continuing our work next fall in the LAMTCN. Now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Laura McGowan Robinson. She is the Diversity and Leadership Institute Chief Executive Officer. Dr. McGowan Robinson, can you please discuss how your work is helping to diversify the educator administrator pipeline and the role that professional leadership and development plays?
Thank you so much for the question and for the opportunity to be with you all today. Before I begin answering that question, I'd like to start with a quote by Gloria Ladson-Billings to ground in the discussion that we've been having and how I'll further it a bit today. I do know the experience of walking into schools, especially elementary and middle schools, where Black students ask me with eagerness, "Are you a teacher here?" And I recognize the disappointment that falls over those same faces when I shake my head no. Their longing for a teacher that looks like them is palpable. And while I'll be talking about the administrator pipeline, I believe that this extends to school leaders as well. While this wasn't my experience, I believe that this is the experience, and no, based on the data, this is the experience of far too many children in the K-12 public school system across the state of California. I'm going to talk a little bit, if we can advance the slide, about the work of the Diversity in Leadership Institute, starting with our mission and vision. But the impetus for our work was a study, the Charting the Course to Equity study, that looked at the impact of administrators of color, specifically Black and Latinx administrators in public schools across the state of California. And what that study found and confirmed what I already believed to be true was that racial diversity among our administrative ranks does make a difference in terms of student outcomes, specifically college readiness, A through G completion rates, and also academics, specifically in math and ELA. And have, while there's significant data to support across the board, regardless of race, but had higher achievement rates for African American and Latinx students. So that was the beginning of the work of Diversity and Leadership Institute. And our organization was created to bring about equitable outcomes for Black and Latinx students by doing movement building. So going beyond policies and programs, but really harnessing the gifts and talents, and also the agency that exists among Black and Latinx leaders, but also allies and co-conspirators who see the value in a racially diverse educator workforce. And with the goal of ultimately achieving our mission so that public school leaders will reflect and honor the diversity of the communities they serve and achieve equity for Black and Latinx students. So I'm going to use the remainder of my time, if you could advance the slide, to talk a little bit more about some specifics and how we approach the work at Diversity and Leadership Institute, and getting to the question about how we support leaders of color, administrators, how we contribute to the pipeline, and why we think leadership development is so important. So our work is comprised of 4 interrelated, mutually supporting initiatives, and each one of these pieces is crucial for the advancement of a sustained educator of color workforce in the state of California. I'll start with our first initiative, and that is the Aspiring Principal of Color Fellowship. And we do this fellowship in a partnership with Loyola Marymount University. It is a 16-month program. It is leadership development, but it's rooted specifically in culturally responsive school leadership. And we look at the role that race, power, and privilege play in how policy is created, and also the unique approach that culturally responsive leaders of color can play in disrupting some of the systems and practices that have served to further marginalize students of color. We believe that educators of color play a vital role, as the data say, in improving outcomes for Black and Latinx students. So at the end of this 16-month program, our candidates earn a Tier 1 administrative credential. We launched our program in the Bay Area last year, and we are now bringing our program to 20 soon to be announced new Black and Latinx leaders in Southern California. So we're excited about this incoming class and the growth of our program. Second thing that we focus on is advocacy and coalition building. Dr. Nava talked about one of the resolutions that we actually led on within LA Unified, and that was the Black Educator Resolution. But essentially, the work around our advocacy and coalition work is recognition that while it is important to do the work of the fellowship in terms of fueling the pipeline and supporting and by providing leadership development, it is also important to create the policy conditions so that educators of color can stay in the profession. And that was what that resolution was about. Because we are a statewide organization, we also engage in some legislative advocacy as well, and have been engaged in efforts to increase funding for administrators, both of color and folks who are not of color necessarily, but who have a commitment to ensuring that they are creating environments that are affirming and supportive of educators of color by providing anti-bias training and recognizing the role that allies and co-conspirators play in the retention, recognizing that right now they make up the majority of the workforce, but how can they in their work also support pipelines or develop pipelines within their own schools. So that, and we also lead our advocacy work in coalition with other partners. So currently our advocacy coalition work includes 13 organizations, both local and national, that have made a commitment singularly within their organizations, but through our coalition work to address policy or present policy or support policy that will lead to the sustaining of and the recruitment of educators of color. The School Leader of Color Network is another centerpiece of our work, which we'll be launching next fall. But essentially, this is a community building effort. It is a way to promote constant learning within affinity spaces for folks who come through our program. And lastly, racial diversity, equity, and inclusion support. This is how we provide systemic support to charter management organizations and districts who've made a commitment to diversify their pipeline, but lead support in how to do that work. So that concludes the 4 prongs of our work. And thank you so much for this opportunity. I'll turn it back over to you, John.
Okay, and thank you, Dr. McGowan Robinson. It's very insightful, the information that you provide, because we need to continue retaining our administrators as well as our teachers of color. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Sam Jelinas. Sam Jelinas is the Greater Los Angeles Education Foundation Interim Executive Director. My question for you, Mr. Jelinas, is please describe how your work in the Greater LA Education Foundation seeks to advance deeper collaboration between schools and communities by providing educator diversity support to LA County.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here on behalf of the Greater LA Education Foundation, and so grateful for the chance to share a little bit more about our work to better recruit and retain diverse educators. So my name is Sam Jelinas. I am the Interim Executive Director for the Greater LA Education Foundation. We're the philanthropic arm of the Los Angeles County Office of Education. LACO is the largest regional education service provider in the county. We support 80 districts in LA County, nearly 1.5 million students that are in K-12 districts, and 2 million students under 18. As I'm sure many folks are aware, about 85% of the students in LA County are students of color. More than 70% are from low-income backgrounds. We're a new entity. We were founded in 2019, and we work with LACO leadership and staff to support districts across a variety of program and impact areas. But one of our founding sort of impact areas and programmatic focuses was educator pipeline development, and specifically how we as a region can better recruit and support and retain educators of color. Over the past several years, we've invested in the issue through a few key avenues. Can we advance to the next slide? Perfect. So first, we wanted to support a regional understanding of and investment in this issue. So we developed a white paper called Advancing a Diverse Future. It's something that is available on our website, easy to find. If folks haven't had a chance to look at it, strongly encourage you to do so. But in that white paper, we explored the state of educator diversity in LA County and opportunities to better recruit, support, and retain local educators. That analysis provided really valuable regional context, and it also helped us as a foundation think about how better to support districts committed to this issue through new programs. Just as sort of relevant context, among the approximately 1.5 million students, 74,000 teachers, and 6,800 school administrators in LA County, there are significantly more students of color, about 85% than teachers, 57%, and administrators about 60%. The largest gap just in terms of representation is between Latinx students and teachers. Latinx students are about 65% of the total LA County population. Teachers are about 33%. We also saw some trends that my fellow panelists have echoed. So we saw deeper trends around representation. So just for example, Black students are about 8% of the population. Teachers are about 8% of the population in terms of the workforce. but many districts saw a shortage of Black male teachers who are only 2% of the teacher workforce in LA County. And we also just saw tremendous variability in districts with the highest shares of Black and Latinx students and teacher representation. Next slide, please. So as one of the consequences that emerged from that analysis, one of the opportunities was to support districts that wanted to do something specifically around this issue. So last year, we launched a group called the Network for Advancing a Diverse and Culturally Responsive Workforce. We're working with the strategy firm WestEd and the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and HR teams at LACO. The network is made up of 6 districts and LEAs that are just hugely divergent in terms of size, experience with targeted recruitment and retention efforts, and really different diverse student populations. But in total, these districts serve approximately 65,000 students, which is equivalent to roughly the 5th biggest school district in California. We selected districts through an application process, which was mostly used to ensure that we were bringing teams together that were really committed to this issue front end and had committed leadership buy-in. Each team that's part of the network is made up of HR leadership, school admin, teachers, and in some cases, board members. Over the past year, we've worked with each team to develop a unique theory of action, build internal data, and develop action plans that address specific strategies in recruitment, hiring and selection, and retention. We've also been able to use small micro grants to support internal strategies like building affinity groups, teacher recognition awards, stipends for training and mentorship. We're working with all of our teams through individual consultancies, so where we have one-on-one time with the teams, and then also bringing the full group together for collaboration and resource sharing. I do want to just note that this has been a really difficult year to address sort of systemic and issues around hiring and strategic staffing. So much the past year has been responsive and just struggling to stay open and managing the day-to-day reality of running schools through a pandemic. We've seen a ton of turnover in staff and admin, and so it has been a really difficult time to address an issue that's complicated under the best of circumstances. Next slide, please. So we're also looking for other strategic opportunities to support districts as they evolve based on new policies and demographic changes. So for example, we know that districts will be adding staff in light of the UPK, the Universal Preschool expansion by 2025. So I think current estimates are around 10,000 new educators around the state. And we also know that decreased enrollment is a major trend facing districts all over LA County and California. But over the last 2 years, we've actually seen an increase of about 100,000 English learners in California, about 30,000 of whom are enrolled in LA County schools. The largest increase came in kindergarten. So that is a major trend and one that we need to think about how to support intentionally with staffing. So the CDE has UPK teacher training programs available, new credentialing pathways, and residencies. And so we are working with several partners, including the California Community Foundation and a network called the English Learner Workforce Investment Network, to really center the needs of multilingual learners for LA County district recruitment and training programs to build this new staff capacity. So we're doing this by providing direct grant writing supports that have language they can use that center multilingual learners, focus on cultural responsiveness, cultural relevancy. We're also providing direct grant writing supports for districts that are eligible to apply for CDE funds. And we're going to be providing early implementation support through collaborative networks for districts that actually receive funding to successfully implement these new programs. But we will continue to look for opportunities to align resources and supports with all of the relevant sort of demographic trends and statewide and local policies to support a diverse and culturally responsive and effective workforce. So thank you all
for your presentation, Mr. Zelinas. We're going to shift gears. We don't have time for the Q&A. The State of California Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond, is our distinguished keynote speaker. In his first term, Superintendent Thurmond led California public schools through one of the most difficult times of our lifetimes. This commitment has been manifested in multiple accomplishments that are too numerous to mention here. However, today, Superintendent Thurmond will discuss his work to co-author and support the passage of AB 520 legislation to diversify the California workforce. Thank you, Superintendent Thurmond.
Dr. Reveles, thank you. Thank you to FEDCO and everyone participating in the Educator Diversity Virtual Symposium. We look forward to hearing what's come out of today's conversation. We know that this is a critical time for us to build an education system that addresses historic levels of bias and disparity that have impacted many children in our state for far too long, and that we will find a way to change that. I won't belabor the point. I know that you all have discussed today the benefits of diversifying our educator workforce, and in particular, finding ways to attract more male educators of color to our workforce. And in that way, I'm grateful to the work of Dr. Noguera and Dr. DomNwachukwu and Dr. McGowan and others who presented today. Because we believe in the power of diversifying our educator workforce, we wrote and sponsored a bill, AB 520, that would provide funds to school districts to essentially diversify by adding male educators of color into our classrooms. We know that there are many school districts that have pipeline programs. I know that in the Bakersfield area and in the Inland Empire and in many communities there are pilot programs, but we want to be more intentional about attracting more male educators of color and diversifying our workforce in general. You all seen the research that says simply having one educator of color makes a difference for students of color and for students of all backgrounds. One Black teacher in a school can make all the world of difference for African-American students and from students from all backgrounds in terms of graduation rates and the likelihood to going on to college. And so we wrote this bill, and we ran into the wall that is known as Prop 209, a constitutional law that says you can't talk about race in higher education or in hiring and how we support small businesses. But our premise is, if we can't talk about race, how do we address the systemic racism that has impacted so many of our students? We know our students can achieve, but there are barriers that have been in their way, and we want to remove those barriers. In spite of Prop 209 and the prohibitions that we ran into in the California State Legislature, we found a way to get essentially what the bill was about incorporated into the state budget. And so that meant that the legislature and the governor adopted what was in the bill, AB 520, and said that we will provide money to school districts and higher education institutions to do many things to diversify our workforce, including attract and retain male educators of color to work in our schools. That was done by putting $350 million into the state budget for residency programs. And those dollars are currently available and being administered by the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing to support any candidate who wants to become a teacher. And so we would submit to you that now is a time for us to accelerate our efforts to diversify our educator workforce. We know that there is a mismatch between the beautiful diversity of our students and those who teach them. And while we believe that everyone can help, we know that there are great benefits when students see someone who looks like them. That's why we've made significant investments to make ethnic studies a graduation requirement in our state. It's why our office is administering, as we speak, a $10 million grant to school districts that addresses bias, and a $1 billion grant on what we call educator effectiveness, so that we can provide training, professional learning to help our educators work past bias and to find ways to support our students. It's why we're sponsoring legislation that essentially would ban expulsions and suspensions in preschool, because we know that more times than not, students of color and African-American students and African-American boys are those who get suspended and expelled. I don't know what one has to do to be expelled from school when you're 3 or 4 years old, but we know that pushes our students in the criminal justice system. And we want to educate and not incarcerate our kids. And so we join with the call of many of you who have lifted up the importance of attracting more male educators of color and a more diverse workforce in general. I want to thank Dr. Travis Bristol out of UC Berkeley, who has chaired a number of workforce groups that we have put together focused on diversifying the teacher workforce. And I also want to call out some efforts that we think will help to create a pathway. Because right now, California has a very patchwork way of recruiting teachers and classified staff. In California, like most states, is experiencing a major workforce shortage. And it's heartbreaking to hear that many say they can make more money working in fast food than becoming a classified staff person, and in other cases, a credentialed teacher. And so we've got to do better by what we provide by way of compensation and training. We have to help our educators who are already, our educators of color who are already teaching in the classroom, and help them and support them. We hear from many of our diverse teachers that they experience microaggressions that ultimately push them out of the profession. And so we believe that we have to have a statewide recruitment effort, not just at the individual district level, but a statewide recruitment effort that helps us attract the number of candidates that we need to attract to become the educators of today and tomorrow. And the state has resources to make this happen. In addition to the $350 million for residency programs, we also have $500 million for anyone who wants to become a teacher in California. We are working with our governor and our legislature to expand that pot of money so that we can also make those scholarships available to someone who wants to become a mental health clinician working in our schools. Given the trauma of the pandemic of racism that we have seen time and time and time again, and sadly the traumas that we are experiencing all across the world in places like Texas and Buffalo and others, and these heartbreaking tragedies, we know that we have to help our students heal from the trauma that they experience. That means we need 10,000 more mental health clinicians, and we've introduced legislation to help us get there in SB 1229. And the $500 million in scholarships makes it possible for us to recruit more mental health clinicians and teachers who can diversify our school workforce. I'll leave you with this, and I'm grateful for the invitation today to bring you greetings from our state capitol, where we're working with our legislator and our governor on new proposals to help us diversify our school workforce. That there is an effort right now to recruit more than 6,000 mentors and tutors who are college students across our state. These students will be paid to be mentors and tutors in our community, and they will be given money to complete their college education. It's called the College for All Core. And I would submit to you that for us to diversify the workforce, that we have to build a pipeline from places like the 6,500 member College for All Core, and from those who work in our expanded learning programs or after school programs. Many of the folks who work in those programs reflect the diversity of our communities. These are the places that we can start as we look to build a pipeline of adding more male educators of color and diversifying our workforce, working with our classified staff. We have a scholarship for someone who might be working as a custodian or working in the office or working as a one-to-one aide who wants to become a credentialed teacher. And so while there are many challenges that our students are facing, we know that our students are more than the sum of their circumstances. We know that they demonstrate resiliency, and we know that this is the moment for us to build a better education system than what we had before, with equity at the center, addressing the lack of equity, closing learning gaps, and providing resources to support our students' achievement, including providing more educators of color. I want to thank you for your interest in the work that we've done with AB 520, the residency dollars that are available to add more male educators of color and to diversify the workforce. We look forward to the learning that comes out of today's conversations and how we can partner with you here at the California Department of Education to diversify our workforce and to support our nearly 6 million students in the great state of California. Thank you for the opportunity to bring you some greetings, and we look forward to the work that goes forward beyond from today's convening.
Superintendent Thurmond, It's so exciting to hear your message today. Powerful, powerful words. I'm Maria Ott, and I have the honor of serving on the FEDCO Charitable Foundation Board, and also I'm a professor at USC Ross Sears School of Education. I just was so excited by what you put on the table for us. The fact that you're leading this also is really gives me hope for the future. There were times where I didn't think we would ever move the needle, but listening to you today, I see that there's an opportunity to increase the pipeline, to not only increase the pipeline, but to support the teachers as they go into those positions and to retain them for the long term. I loved what you said, that we need to accelerate the effort. This is the time, right? The resources are there. We need to accelerate our effort. Your insights about what you're doing as state superintendent gives us optimism, but we know we need to remain committed to doing the hard work. It was so impressive to hear you describe the way you're approaching the challenge, and your words of wisdom are genuinely appreciated. Thank you so much. I'm going to close today by thanking our sponsors. First, the California Community Foundation and FEDCO Charitable Foundation Board, represented by Dr. Stu Gothold, the board chair. You had the vision for making this regional symposium a possibility, and special thanks to Vince Flowers for his behind the scenes work, bringing all these distinguished speakers to us today. So special thanks to our sponsors, USC Ross Sears School of Education, Cal State University San Bernardino College of Education, and Cal State University Northridge College of Education. Special thanks to our esteemed panelists. Your discussion, advice, insights, and wisdom advanced our knowledge to support this crucial work. And then finally, special thanks to our audience for making time to demonstrate your value for this work. Together, we can move the agenda and ensure our students enter schools and districts that reflect the rich diversity of California. Si se puede. Yes, we can do this. We appreciate all of you. Thank you for being here today.